that I started thinking about Thomas Jefferson on the Declaration of Independence and the part about our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I remember thinking, how did he know to put the pursuit part in there? That maybe happiness is something that we can only pursue, and maybe we can actually never have it, no matter what. How did he know that? That quote is from Chris Gardner, played by Will Smith in the movie The Pursuit of Happiness. Thank you very much for the work that you just put in to find us on the Axe and Scalpel Podcast. My name is Johnny V. I've kind of dabbled in radio for about 15 years, done plenty of blue-collar work, and even a tad bit of the white-collar variety, all legal, mind you. And I'm also joined by a couple of great friends. First off, in front of me, Dr. Jacob Smith, and slightly askew to the left of me, not all your opinions are, but just presently to the left of me, Dr. Rick Rapp. How are you boys doing today?
Doing well. So I'm Dr. Rick Rapp, family physician here in rural northwoods of Wisconsin. Went to the Des Moines University College of Osteopathic Medicine and then residency in Orlando, Florida before God brought me up here, and like to also really dive into faith and theology and then other things, books, philosophy, outdoors. Yeah.
Jacob.
Amen. Yeah, my name is Jacob Smith, and I live here in Bruce, Wisconsin, actually. I am a veterinarian. I've been married to my wife, Brian, for, we've been together for almost 20 years now, believe it or not, and we have 5 beautiful children. I am a graduate of the University of Minnesota School of Veterinary Medicine in 2013. I also completed a fellowship with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview in 2021. So I have the student loan debt to prove all of this schooling too. And
Amen.
Yes, sir. And I love spending time in the outdoors. My hobbies is hunting and staying active. I love reading the great books, and I'm a big believer that the best sport in the entire world is the sport of ice hockey. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm kind of excited to get started today. I've got a subject for you fellas, and it relates to our introduction here. And today's subject I want to tackle is the pursuit of happiness. And the reason so, fellas, is this is one of those things that we live in the era of, and I want to get into this a little bit with you, Rick, as a family physician, is everybody's unhappy, it seems. And if they're not unhappy, they're somewhere on the trek to pursuing happiness. And it seems like all we read is negative things in the news about this and troubles people are having. And so I kind of want to tackle the subject. What does it mean to be happy? So I guess I'd start with you guys, fellas. Johnny, what is being happy? What is being happy to you, man?
Well, happy is right now doing this podcast with you guys. First
amen.
off, that makes me very,
right.
very happy.
Amen.
And actually, before we dive into this, I have to get something off of my chest right now. I get this question, believe it or not, I think we have some listeners out there, boys.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been getting asked, how did the Axe and Scalpel Podcast name originate? And being that we're always going to be evolving on this podcast and our own pursuit of happiness, I would like to know, and Rick, I kind of cheated. He sent me a text message about a week and a half ago about this answer. But please, let our fantastic, faithful listeners know, how did you come up with the Axe and Scalpel, not Staple, podcast?
Yeah, so there is actually a distant tradition here, and it kind of comes from a lot of our goals and objectives of digging into issues and attacking things and dissecting things from, in a broad sense, but then also in a very targeted, thoughtful sense. But the real history comes from actually the Bible. So in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah was a Jewish leader that was charged while the Jews were in exile, he was charged to go back to Jerusalem and lead the people in rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. And so that's what that book of the Bible is generally about. But in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 15 through somewhere around 20, just says, when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. They had been trying to stop the wall from being built, because that would limit their access to those people. So from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And then he said, those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. This gave a famous image of the sword and the trowel.
Okay.
Trowel for digging, a sword for fighting. And this was picked up on by a famous Christian minister in the 1800s, Charles Spurgeon, C.H. Spurgeon. And he created a theology magazine called The Sword and Trowel. And that has continued to go on. And now there's even, in the tradition of that, there is a large podcast called The Sword and Trowel. So my thought was, well, want to have that kind of thought? What would be a more fitting image for Northwoods, two physicians, this kind of thing? And so that's where the idea of the axe and the scalpel came from.
Well done. So there's some brains behind that, is what you're telling me.
Some brains.
And of course, Jacob brings the brawn.
But you talk about happiness. Thinking along those paths and trying to integrate and say, how can faith and scripture and these deeper spiritual things be relevant to what I am doing today? That to me is a huge component of happiness. But I'd say, what is happiness? I would use words like contentment in your circumstances. Being able to just look around at what you're in right now and smile and feel blessed and to lay the frustrations aside.
Well, so here's where I'm getting at then, is I want to hear John's opinion on this too, but is that what you think most Americans believe happiness is today?
No. Most Americans believe happiness comes from a lot of materialistic things a lot of times. I'll quickly put you on the spot. What is a thing that just makes you happy? First thing that maybe comes to mind. What can happen during a course of your day that all of a sudden just makes you happy?
A dump truck pulls up with $100 bills and unleashes it on the back of my porch, John.
Okay, Jacob's just... That's okay. I didn't ask you what happened to you last Wednesday.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that happens to you all the time, but how about you, Rick? What happened today that made you happy? I know there's something.
So my middle child, my oldest daughter, agreed to play a Mario Party game with myself, my wife, and the youngest daughter, and just laughed and giggled throughout. And I mean, just looking over, that was a moment of happiness. So, yeah.
It seems to me, the reason I bring it up is because it seems everything you read in the news, and there's studies that are constantly cited on this subject, and I'm going to share a little bit of it here as we go. But it's there, and Rick brought up the content or the idea of contentment, and I think, boy, that I think if there's one thing we're lacking in the country right now, that's contentment. I just think you see that in how uncivil our political discourse is, and how everything now, everybody's level of contentment seems to be tied in with politics. Like, we just kind of live in this crazy time. And so that's one of the reasons I want to alter the direction of the podcast, because we've kind of been in the toy store there, if you will, and talked a little politics, and we dabbled in sports, which I love too, etc. But some of these kind of philosophical subjects I think is fun to get into once in a while. And so I'd start by asking you, Rick, as a physician, you've been practicing now for a couple decades. What are you seeing as a physician in your clinic in terms of maybe increases in people needing, mental health help, whether that's pharmaceutically or just via counseling, or maybe just people scheduling appointments to talk to you because you're a physician, you're trusted, and they just need somebody to talk to? What are you seeing over the years with kids and adults alike there?
Oh, yes. So it's been massive. And recently COVID didn't help at all with that. But yeah, so I can say that for 80% of the patients coming in, mental health is a major component of the symptoms they're experiencing. And these are physical symptoms, but, their pain is exacerbated by just being depressed or anxious. Their fatigue, that's a crazy common one that I can look at most of those folks and say, we can test you up and down for vitamin deficiencies and sleep apnea and thyroid problems, but I can guarantee you that this is probably a depression, anxiety related thing.
Sure. The mental effects of physical
health. I mean, you're seeing especially the effects of technology. The doom scrolling on phones has, particularly for women, the more time spent on social media, the higher the levels of anxiety for men. The most you see more lethargy. So our depression comes from not, or manifests more in the not wanting to do things, and then as fatigue and that sort of thing. And certainly time just spent, watching sports, watching TV, watching just useless things and not sleeping well because of it. And I mean, it's really damaged because we're not outside, we're not using our bodies. So mental health, people are not happy. There's a lot of loneliness. People don't know how to solve relationship problems anymore. And then the whole issue in culture of the rise, to quote the title from Carl Truman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's that the world is telling you it's all about you. Live your truth, be the best you. And that just fails. It doesn't work. Yeah. We were designed to live in communion, community. And as we read in Scripture, I mean, God is always, encouraging us to care for others, to be focused on others.
How about in kids, Rick? I mean, that's the biggest concern. Obviously, both you and I are dads. We both got a lot of kids. How about in kids clinically? Are you seeing an increase in the amount of kids who are dealing with mental health distress and things like that?
A higher and a much greater severity than it used to be. This is kids that are expressing severe levels of depression, suicidality, severe anxiety, panic things. Absolutely on the attention deficit, that's gone through the roof in the last 10 years since the last 15 years or since the creation of the smartphone. It's just been devastating along the lines, as well as probably all of the things we're consuming. But we're seeing that just going through the roof, and parents that are just not invested in actually doing anything about it. That they're just like, just let them have their thing. Just give them a drug. It's not or it's, mom has this, grandma has this, so it's just their thing. So so it's just growing through the roof.
What are some of the things that you guys have done to try to maybe limit screen time at your houses and things of that nature? Is it something that you got to kind of have a strict schedule with?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, we can talk about that, and that might be good for a whole.
I think we could have a whole episode on that. Yeah.
But it's one of those of having good conversations with your kids about the things that create negative influences. What is coming in to steal, kill, and destroy? As we brought this up, the first scripture that always comes to mind for me on this issue is, because it's become so central to my life, is John, in the book of John, chapter 10, and I'll go a verse before, in verse 9, it says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, and this is Jesus talking, if anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture, which has a whole sense of peace to it. Then it says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And that's saying, all of these things that we invite into our lives are potential thieves. Anything that we are involved in, whether it's good on the surface or bad on the surface, can become a thief. And so it's being able to recognize what is stealing from your core values, and that's going to destroy you. And so educating our kids on that concept, even before their brains developed enough to really grasp the idea of long-term consequences. So that's been a big thing.
Well, so I just want to interrupt just for a second, Rick, because I think your response here is so important, because you're a science guy.
Yeah.
I'm a science guy. A little bit different fields, but we're both in healthcare, but we both got degrees. I imagine your degree was in biology or a related field. I did biology and chemistry. So we are science guys. And what's really interesting there is you would think, somebody listening to this might think, as I'm asking this question of a physician, that you're going to come back with a science answer. But instead you went with a theological answer. And that's where we're going to, I want to kind of take this later, but that's so important that a guy like you comes back with that level of response, because I think that's a lot of where our answer is. But I wanted to ask Johnny too, because Johnny, you're not in the medical field, but you have a perspective here that I think could bring value.
I can Google.
Well, Dr. Google, but no, what you brought up earlier, in our introductions, that you've been in radio for many years, but then you're kind of been working blue collar job for the last number of years. And blue collar jobs, man, I associate that with my grandfather and a lot of men of older generations, because that's how families were raised. My grandfather was a laborer in U.S. Steel for 30 plus years, and then retired on a pension from U.S. Steel as a laborer. He was a Stanley Thermos and locker kind of guy, right? So he was blue collar just like that. But that was what was the fabric of America for so many years, and that's disappearing a little bit, but there's still jobs and there's still industries like the one you work in. So you're around blue collar, middle class people all the time.
Manly men.
But there's a lot of them who are raising families too. Oh, yeah. And so what are you seeing, a level of contentment among those people, or do you see the, kind of discontentment that, seems to be kind of happening nationwide? Are blue collar, in other words, are people living a blue-collar life the same way they were in the 1960s anymore?
Right. It's a great journey, because you meet so many different people, and that's the one thing that this podcast and everything is going to really embrace, is we know that people are different.
Yeah.
We're all different. And like you mentioned, the factory worker versus the 60s today, the gripes are still there.
Yeah.
There's still plenty of the good gripes, but machinery. Think of the technology now.
Oh, sure.
There was a lot of jobs that were in the 60s that, because of technology, they don't exist. A lot of places have moved on to robots, bigger machines, things of that nature. But the mentality, it's just like anything else. Even with the politics.
Yeah.
You have one mill, say you got 100 people. 87 of them might think one way politically, and you got 13 thinking the other way. But at the end of the day, you all put in the same work. Pretty much, you're all getting paid the same, but happiness right now.
Are the people there? Are they content? Are they? Do they have the same? I guess what am I going for here? Do they have the same positive outlook that they might have had in the 1960s, or do you see the same discontentment that maybe Rick and I are talking about, that he might see in clinic, or that I see in the people I deal with every day?
Well, one thing about the factory work that I've kind of learned too is some people, once you get in, you sometimes feel like maybe there's no way out.
Sure.
Especially with small towns.
Dead end. Yeah.
You hear all the time, he was doing all that, and now he's down at the factory. Hey,
yeah,
remember Johnny Football? Now he's down at the factory.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. And that's one of the things. I mean, we have decent industry here. The mentality of people, gosh, they're hardworking. It's just like anything else. Yeah. You got your whiners, you got your complainers, you got your people that, hey, I'm here. I'm thankful for the job, the money that I make, the time that I'm able to afford with my family because of the schedule that I have. The factory worker as a whole, though, might not be as confident in the longevity of the job that they might have 60 We're starting to get those people that have been in some of these places for 40, 50 years retiring. And below them, the longest tenured person can maybe be there 11 years. That's a big, huge gap. We're losing a great generation of workers in the factories right now. They're starting to get up there in age. And the most common worry that I hear is, who's going to take this person's 35 years of experience right now? We don't have anybody.
Yeah.
And to go politically, that's one thing Trump's trying to bring back. There's nothing wrong with working at a factory. You're making somebody's windows for a house. You're making plumbing. When you get into that factory realm, if anything, you're amazed with how many things need to just be made and created for us to enjoy every day of our life. And that's what I see with the United States of American factory worker. In a nutshell, those are the people that you want to be their neighbor. Yeah. Those are the people that...
And so you said
consistent.
You said there what I'm getting at, though,
Yeah.
and I think you answered my question. Is that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you're saying that the older generation views that a little bit differently than the younger generation coming up.
Yes.
Is there's more contentment with say blue collar work in the older generation than there is with the younger one?
I'd say so.
So that's pretty accurate. Okay, because that would make sense. You know what I'm seeing. I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive on this and just kind of look at some of the statistics, like I talked about earlier. And one of the statistics that got brought up. So this is a company using data from the University of Chicago that they've collected for like 45, 50 years. And they were analyzing, just characteristics of people who rated themselves higher on the happiness scale, so to speak. And John kind of brought it up here right now. And one of the characteristics was people age 45 and older. That the level of discontentment is higher in the younger generation. People 45 and older tend to report higher levels of contentment. Now, I don't know if that's a generational thing, or just simply in 2024, it's harder for younger people to feel safe and feel content and feel like they're or feel secure, I guess would be the better word for that. But 45 and older tend to feel better about life and feel happier.
I would be curious if in past years they would find that there's always been a line there.
Yeah.
But probably that there's a more stark difference now because of just the promotion of the therapeutic worldview.
Yeah.
Where it kind of became in vogue, popular to be depressed, to be anxious, to express, to have all of these feelings. And at some point in life, you just learn this isn't important, this isn't important, this is important.
Well, that'd be a good point too. I was going to cut open a little bit of a vein on this because it's something I've thought about over the years. Because somebody might say that, hey, you got a big family, you achieved a professional career, etc. You should be happy and content. But that's not the way things have always went for me personally throughout my life. And so, have you guys ever heard of? I think Rick, maybe you and I have talked about this in the past, just personally. But Johnny, I'll ask you: have you ever heard of something called "if that then" syndrome?
Fire away.
Okay, so "if that then" syndrome is essentially what that means is people have the or people fall into this category where they say to themselves, if that happens, then I'll be happy. So in other words, if I just move out of this neighborhood and into that little higher class one, then I'll be happy. If I sell the old F-150 and I get the new Chevy Silverado, then I'll be happy.
If I get that promotion.
If I get if I can start making $250,000 a year versus $150,000 a year, then I'll be happy. Or
even darker things like if I can break off this marriage and marry this girl, then I'll be happy.
Right, exactly. So if that then syndrome, and it's something as a young man that I struggled with for sure, because one of the things that happened to me, we've talked about in the past, as a young man, my life was tied up completely in playing athletics, and then that's got to end for everybody. So when college ended, athletics was winding down for me. It was clear I was going to play professionally. I had a child on the way, and it was okay. Now what? right? What do you do now? And so I went for the period, things happened to me. I still put my nose to the grindstone and studied hard and graduated from a professional program. Ended up in a career where you can do well financially if you play your cards right. And there's a level of respect that comes with, but still lack of contentment. Right. And had a good relationship, started having children. That shouldn't be an issue there, but still like this inner wrestling lack of contentment. So man, I tried it all. I tried it all to find that. And, a lot of people will go to, drinking, alcohol, drugs. I didn't really, go down that route at all, but it was trying to be a bunch of different things. So, I always had a love of the outdoors and hunting. And so, I watch hunting TV shows, etc. So now, I'm going to be literally the best duck hunter on the planet, right? So I'm going on hunting trips, and I'm spending all this money on hunting gear and having a ball doing this. But then at the same time, the repercussion, of course, of that is it creates strain in the relationship with your wife. It creates time away from your children. It creates time away from your business. So I'm going down that route, and then, okay, that's not working right. So maybe if I get in really good shape, maybe then I'll be happy, right? If that then. So I join a gym. Pretty soon I get into martial arts, and it gives a little bit. I went to a gym where jiu-jitsu was big, and there was guys that were training for mixed martial arts, and so it was an outlet a little bit for your competitiveness at that time and keep you in shape. And I got in really good shape, and oh man, but this isn't working. I'm still the hole's still there. What's going on, right? The hole is still there. And then, if I coached hockey for a long time, if I could just get back into coaching hockey. Well, if that happens, then I'll be happy. And I got back into coaching hockey and got around that environment again. And yet still, man, the hole persists. And so it's this perpetual cycle. And then pretty soon I own a practice. I go from being an employee of a practice to owning a veterinary practice. And okay, now I'm making more money. That should do it, right? But it doesn't do it. It's the perpetual cycle of the if that then syndrome. And so, what does a guy do at that point? Where do you turn?
Maybe that's the word that we're looking for that seems to escape us, I believe, is fulfillment. Fulfillment.
Contentment.
Because contentment's normally, you can look at that one a couple different ways, but contentment also can be very counterproductive. It means like, I'm kind of happy where I am right now. That can maybe prevent you from even going a few steps beyond to achieve even more. Contentment can breed. There's one of those quotes. Contentment can breed like complacency.
Yep.
Yeah. Where fulfillment, it's kind of like you guys' practices, great examples. You get a fulfillment after your job that was done beautifully, correct? There's you have you feel the purpose, you filled a need, you did it successfully.
Yep.
You get that fulfillment that I feel good about myself.
Right, and that's a concept. So, Jake, you hit on essentially core values. What are the things that truly are going to bring fulfillment in your life? And you mentioned a lot of things that in and of themselves are good things. Being in good physical condition, coaching kids in hockey, man, there's good to be had there. Having a business, being your own boss, being able to be a good employer for others, those are good things, but they won't fill what I call the God-shaped hole.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And fulfillment, Johnny, your point is also, I'm glad you brought it up because I hadn't thought as much about that, but it's being content in your circumstances, but not necessarily but not complacent. I still have things to do. So like for me, saying, okay, my work is my primary ministry. It's my opportunity to help the poor, the sick, the needy, to bring some spiritual health there. But I can become complacent and be like, I'm always going to be okay with just doing this. But if I have the opportunity to teach that process of, to other physicians, to young physicians that are struggling, to other professions, that's ways that I can do that while still being conscious of, okay, my other core values are time with my wife and my kids. This is something Jake and I have both been talking together with and with our spouses about in just doing this podcast. There is good in this. This is good for our souls as men to get together with other guys and talk. This fulfills some of our sense of calling for helping other people. But we have to keep in mind our core values of our family and our individual faith. And I want to go real quick because this is how I tend to think, that this is Philippians, the book of Philippians in the Bible. This is the Apostle Paul writing. And so Apostle Paul had been the guy who had been on his way as a Jewish Pharisee to being one of the, maybe even a high priest at some point. But he had this conversion experience, met Jesus, and went from being the guy persecuting the Christians to being the guy spreading the gospel, the Christian truth around all of the Mediterranean. And he wrote this to the Philippians in Greece and said, you were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. You know, and Paul had this calling and this mission, and he learned how to be content, whether he had a lot of support, a lot of food, or he was having success in his vocation. He would still work as making tents of all things. But he was not satisfied with just that. He could have found, you know, one of these cities that the ministry was just thriving and growing, and he, you know, he was supported, and he was just super content in that. But he still knew that he had this calling on his life, this core value of reaching other people. And he knew he was going to go into bad situations. He knew he was going to get thrown in jail again. He knew he was going to get beat again. This happened. He knew he was going to get shipwrecked. How many times was he shipwrecked? 3 times? That's what he said in one thing. So that's the thing. It's staying somewhat in your lane, but still moving forward. You're a business owner, and there's so much good in that, but there's a lot of junk, right? You're a coach. There's so much good in that. There's a lot of junk. But if God has really put that calling on you, you can be content with the junk.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean you just accept it and you don't try to change it to some extent, but you accept, okay, what can I actually affect? And for me, like in healthcare, there's a lot of stuff I don't like. I don't like all the extra paperwork and things like that. But it allows me to do for patients in the system that we have now. It makes it possible for me to be doing that and fulfilling that vocation. So
I want to throw a little bit more data here from you guys in this University of Chicago information. So, and these all come with an asterisk. So these are characteristics of people data wise that are identify themselves as happier. And this is interesting, but like I said, I'm going to throw the asterisk.
I'm excited about this. I think I'm some of what's coming.
I'm going to throw the asterisk here at the end. So one, and this is, you might laugh at this, but you might say, oh yeah, that makes sense. But marriage.
Yeah, makes people happier.
Consistent data. The marriage makes people happier. Income level. Okay. Well, now, we're going to get the biblical argument here, but hear me out until this is done. Income level. Actually, the higher the income, there's an association with a level of happiness. Again, wait for the asterisk here. Education level. The more educated you are, generally more associated with a level of happiness. Okay. Now here's where so those 3 things are, things that we can all relate to, but the asterisk here is those things all are related to a higher level of happiness, but there's a flat line there.
Yeah, it doesn't go up beyond.
It's not a continual.
Being married to 3 women isn't more.
You're right. Yeah, yeah. In fact, I think it would go down. And it would go because 3 times the trouble, Rick. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, but there is a flat line among all those things, right? And so in other words, you
achieve a certain level of security.
Yeah, Jesus was still right on the money thing, right? Because you achieve a level of exactly what you're saying, like in terms of income, you achieve a level of security. But past that, if you go from being middle class guy to Jeff Bezos, that's not necessarily, you're not necessarily at an advantage there. If you go from, homeless without a shelter over your head to middle class guy, there's an advantage there. But jumping, tax brackets necessarily isn't something that's correlated. The marriage thing, we laugh at that a little bit because you're going to make your level of happiness there based on what you put into your marriage. And that can be a whole nother topic we can have, especially from a theological perspective. But, again, sense of security, maybe Dr. Rapp?
Sense of security, having somebody that relies on you, that you rely on, that they're there for you. It fills that need of communion, of community. Those are big parts, but I would go back to, again, it's God's, how God designed us, creation order. He made them male and female, he said it is not good for man to be alone in the book of Genesis. So he made the pinnacle of creation. Yes, I'm pandering again to women because I believe it as the final star on top of the tree of creation. It is good. Now he has made, some people that are able to be quite content. Paul, again, talks about this, that he's content with not being married, and he would hope that more people could be that way so they could devote their lives entirely to.
Well, Paul had a different marriage, right?
Yeah, he had a different marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, that's a good point. We're all married to something.
Yeah.
And what is the object of our affection, and is it something that's truly?
Yeah. Paul was married to the church, and being married to my wife is just like being married to the church. It's just grace every day, right? Same thing for you, right?
Well, it's more grace than we deserve.
Yeah, you're probably right
there
about
are times
that.
when grace could be,
absolutely.
But it also gives us opportunities to offer grace and mercy.
The last one there now, education. I've got to think maybe you guys will have a different comment on this. I got to think education. There's got to be a corollary there, probably between that and income level, then that would, tie the whole thing together. I don't know. Going to a lot of school is stressful. I don't know how you felt about it, but, and like I said, I got the student loans to prove it, and that doesn't exactly bring contentment. So,
education. Again, it's going back to how are you designed and wired. Now, I love learning, and that's the thing of wanting to continue to do this. I love the camaraderie of a school cohort of students going through those things. But I would say some of it is more time, at least in history, with when there was more true liberal arts and you were being exposed to a lot of different things, you could really find, as much as I speak against the live your own truth and things, you can really find who you are through that experience. You get to be in a somewhat sheltered environment in college, in theory, to learn new things, to have your horizons expanded a bit, and that can be good. It absolutely can be bad, and we see that. As a parent, I think about those things, but I think that really helps you figure out who you are, who God designed you to be in that education process.
Well, I want to kind of tie this. I want to bring this whole thing back around then, because in kind of where we started. And Rick, again, to your credit, Rick, you've been a science guy bringing the theological answer here, which I think is so important for people to hear. But you gave me a book here, Rick. I don't know, maybe about a month ago, by a guy named J.P. Moreland. J.P. Moreland is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Biola University, which is a theological university or a Christian university.
Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
Yeah. And so this book is Love Your God with All Your Mind. And there's a passage in this book that really stuck out to me and kind of prompted me to look at this a little bit. And Moreland says, his quote here is happiness used to be understood as a life of virtue. and the successful person was the one who knew how to live life well according to the creative design by God. And then what he goes on to say here is for the ancient Greeks, like the ones that Paul, of course, preached to in Philippi and elsewhere, and for the and people in the Old Testament times, it meant a life of intellectual and moral virtue. So there we go back to the lifelong learning, and then we go back to the moral virtue. And where do we draw our morals, of course, right? There's no better place than the big, thick book Dr. Rapp has right in front of him there. And so that got me thinking, and just as me as a person, I get pleasure from being well-read, from being informed. And I also find contentment, through Christ and through what I've read in Scripture and the relationship I've developed with Jesus since I became a Christian for the first time more than, 10 to 15 years ago per se. And so I was... I go back, Rick, you and I, we share the commonality that we both like spy novels, correct?
Yes.
Black Ops. Yeah.
Give me Clancy.
Yeah.
Give me Vince Flynn.
Because before you and I became healthcare professionals, I'm sure just like many young boys, we had dreams of being Rambo or Jack Ryan or...
Yeah, I routinely, when I am getting on a plane, am pre-planning how I'm going to take out the terrorists.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
and then how you will kiss your wife as the plane takes off and all the people are saved, and the police sirens are all going off around.
And
you.
then
I
land the plane.
You land the plane.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm not joking that I have these thoughts.
Swiss Army knife of heroes over here.
Exactly. I especially love the Vince Flynn novels because the main character is Mitch Rapp.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
that's
so
right.
I can read phrases like Rapp shot the terrorist or Rapp,
and envision yourself right there.
Defused the nuclear dirty bomb.
Well, and I say this jokingly before we wrap up, but one of the novelists in that genre that I've grown to like here in the last couple of years is a guy named Jack Carr. And there's a series now on, I think it's Amazon Prime, or came out a couple of years ago, called The Terminal List, that is derived off of his books. But he has a phrase that he goes to frequently, and I don't know if this is true or not, if this is actually something the CIA does, but Carr in his novels refers to people in the CIA, them having a saying, and that saying is they want their people in the CIA to be a PhD that can win a bar fight.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself when I read that the first time, I was like, God dang it, that is what I want to be in life there, right?
John is the T-Rex desire.
Yeah. I grew out of that. But if there's something short to sum it up, what you might want to be is the ideal of masculinity. I don't know what is, but I thought of that as related to what Moreland says here is again, happiness is understood as living a life of virtue, and virtue being intellectual virtue and moral virtue, being a good person and knowing what the heck you're talking about, right?
Correct.
And so the moral part, Rick, I think that's where this has got to go, right? Because everybody can be well learned. You can be of any walk of life, religion, etc., and you can be well learned, but it's getting the moral part right.
Right.
And I believe some guy named JC, he had something to say about that, right?
Yeah. So having your values in the right place. We see throughout, Jesus' ministry that we these days refer to as kind of this upside down kingdom where people that we would normally not attribute the greatest to are, the poor, the weak, the needy, those who are humble and content in that, are the ideal. But he also routinely interacted both with intellectuals and met them at their level, and he interacted with people who were not intellectuals or were poor, and he could interact at their level, and he could bring them the same moral teaching, and would routinely get back to, these things. We talked about the scribe who approached him and that brought about the parable of the Good Samaritan. who answered correctly that the two most important pieces of the law are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your spirit, with all your mind, and to then love your neighbor as yourself. He knew those words. He knew the principles. He had some idea of it. He had worked somewhat throughout his life towards that, but he still didn't quite have the moral virtue behind it.
Well, I went to this when I was looking at this, and I wanted to know, of course, it makes this incredibly unhealthy advanced tool we have in our hand called the iPhone. It does have an advantage in some areas.
A great advantage when you can,
and so it helps me break apart Scripture pretty quick. And so I ran a Google and let their AI do its work. And what does Jesus say about happiness? And you know how when you Google something, like whatever the most popular Google search is, using those letters or those phrases will come up at the top. And of course, one of them was, what does Jesus say about happiness? As soon as I typed, what does Jesus say? Happiness came right up there at the top. So that tells you something itself.
People are searching for it.
But what the search brought up is where a lot of pastors and theologians went with this immediately in our Bible in terms of Jesus' commentary on happiness is the Beatitudes. And I know, Rick, you and I, we share a church home together, and that's one of the things that's been discussed recently. And so I just wanted to read a little bit of this. And I'm going to read just kind of the opener, because the Beatitudes have about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 8, or about 10 lines actually, where he gives a statement and then defends it briefly. But I'm just going to give the statement. And as opposed to saying happiness, Jesus says blessed. And so the people who are blessed, who's happy, who's blessed? Well, he says in the beginning, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Yeah. Interesting stuff there, because he doesn't say anything about that $250,000 dump truck I was alluding to earlier, does he?
No, and he does allude to that there's some hardship involved, right?
Yes.
Being persecuted for following truth, for following the moral good. And I had heard these throughout my life in church and learned, very recently more of just what do some of these things actually mean? Poor in spirit, what does that actually mean? And so both at our church, but even in one of the ways that God seems to amaze me from day to day is how the same topic comes up in multiple contexts in my life. And I had another podcast that touched on what these phrases mean, and I was doing some of my own study on what they meant. And so I actually brought a commentary with me today to kind of talk through the Beatitudes. Honestly, I'm really, it's cool that you
well, and so I'm gonna use this then. So if we're gonna get to that, I'm gonna use this then to kind of put a bow on this, because I think Moreland, thank you, Rick, for giving me this book, because I really enjoyed reading this stuff from Moreland here, because he puts kind of a bow on this for us, where he says, if we're looking at what Jesus taught, and then we're looking at the fact that happiness, what people thought for centuries, thousands of years, was that happiness can be achieved, or I shouldn't say can be achieved, but can be pursued. Go back to our friend Will Smith there in the beginning, right? Because it's never something that's necessarily achieved, but pursued, and that's part of the human condition, is pursuing a life of intellectual and moral virtue, being well learned, and then being in touch with your Creator, right, to learn the moral part. And what Moreland says here that kind of wraps this up is he says, so if we understood these teachings, through what we learn in the Bible and what we learn through Christ himself and what he said, happiness involves suffering, endurance, and patience, because these are important means to becoming a good person who lives a good life. Sounds a little bit like what Jesus said there in the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't it, Rick?
Absolutely. And I think this is going to lead us into probably this week on Theocuts. We're going to touch on the Beatitudes more, and because this is important. We said earlier, people are hurting. Even those that are actually in a good place have their struggles. And and need to find ways to not descend as far into the depths when they're in difficult times, and to rise higher when things go well.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good way to put a tie on it. Johnny V, you want to close us out?
How do I close out all that stuff?
Well, just tell the people where to find us, Johnny. Tell them.
Give us our blessing.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much once again. That was a fantastic, fantastic episode. And by all means, we are always welcome to comment, share them, positive, negative, inspirational. You want to teach us something, go right ahead. You can find us on YouTube, Podbean, Spotify.
Spotfest, yeah.
Spotfest.
I'm not sure about that one, but it sounds like I want to check it out.
They're linked to the Axe and Scalpel Podcast. Have you heard of that one
That's
before?
their provider, yeah.
But no, thank you very much. New episodes drop each and every Monday. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Johnny V. Dr. Jacob Smith.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Rick Rapp. It's always a pleasure, boys.
And may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and help you find that contentment and fulfillment.
Amen.
Amen.